Let's talk about domain names and URLs and learn a little about technology here. Okay, first of all, it has to do with using the internet. When you use the internet from a smartphone or computer and you go to your web browser, and you type in an address, you're sending a request out to the internet, and it takes it and gets it to the right location, and it finds where a web page is. Say you want to get to google.com or microsoft.com or bobology.com. That request gets sent across the internet and ends up going to the computer where that web page is located. And because it knows the request came from your computer, it sends it back and it's displayed on your computer. So when you're using the web, you're constantly requesting something and receiving something. And so that's basically how it works. It's just that it works so fast, we don't really think about where things are located or how it works, but it works really well. It's really nice. Okay, so where are all these websites located? Well, websites are generally located at facilities called data centers. Most people don't have websites in their homes. Most people have a website that's located in a computer facility called a data center. Some look really nondescript. In fact, most of them do, because they really don't want people knowing that there's a bunch of computers in there. There's millions of dollars worth of computers, and they want them to stay secure and safe. So they're in industrial parks, they're in office buildings. The building at downtown Los Angeles called One Wilshire, that entire office tower is an entire data center, and it's filled with rooms and floors that are filled with computers, and they're filled with computers. Those computers don't need a keyboard or a screen or a mouse. They're controlled remotely by somebody that has access to all of them. And so web hosting services host websites. They provide a facility where you can put a website where it can be available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and they manage the computers. They make sure they run right, and your website runs right. So that's what a data center is. We use data centers a lot these days. We use them not only for websites, we use them for clouds, we use them for email. Pretty much anything that goes on the internet is being done through a data center. And sometimes a message has to get from one data center to another, and there's actually physical wires and cables under the ocean that connect all of these things together all around the world. Pretty amazing. Now, URLs are the addressing scheme of the internet. Just like we have a postal service in the United States that asks you to put somebody's name, a business name, a street number, a street name, a city, state, and zip code on an envelope in order to address it, the internet has something kind of like that. It's called URLs. They're called Uniform Resource Locators. It's a website address. And so this whole phrase here that begins with http://www.bobology.com, and you can substitute whatever you want in here, is a URL. And it's used on the web to link to web pages and help direct web browsers to go to web pages. So the parts of URL are pretty simple. The protocol is something that computers need. It tells the computers how to get the data. So this HTTP, and there's another one called HTTPS for secure websites, is basically the information that tells a computer, this is looking for information that's going to be contained in a package that looks like this. So think of a package that you might get from Amazon, or another package you might get from a grocery store, and another one you might get from Priority Mail. And those are different packages, and they might get delivered in different ways. So those HTTP and HTTPS are used by computers to tell you. Most of the time when we go to web browsers on our computers, we don't need to type this in anymore. In fact, we don't really need to type in pretty much anything until after the www dot. But computers automatically need them, and so web browsers automatically put them. So why is there a colon and a slash slash? Well, computers aren't really very smart. They need tools to tell them that something's different between one type of information and another. And so they need to know that after the HTTP, there's something else, okay? And in this case, it's www, which stands for World Wide Web, which at one time didn't exist, right? So it was something that people invented and created. So this is the front end that tells computers pieces of information that they need to know. But the domain name is something that a computer needs to know as well. It's just that people understand characters as opposed to numbers. And so we like to use words and phrases that we can remember. We remember them better than numbers. I don't know if you're aware of it, but the reason that there used to be only 7 digits in phone numbers, and now there's a few more sometimes for international, but is because the 7 was a number. If you had 8, it became much more difficult for people to remember a phone number. Now, like you probably keep all your phone numbers and your contacts, and I don't remember a whole lot of phone numbers, but I remember the phone number from when I was a kid. You probably do as well when the place you grew up. So that's something that we tend to recognize. So domain names are this part of the URL, whereas this is all part of the computer language that's being used for it. So the domain name is this text description of a location on the internet. It really is a location on the internet. It's some data center somewhere. It could be in Spain, it could be in Peru, it could be in San Francisco, it can be in Finland. You don't really know where it physically is located. You just know that when you ask a web page to get sent back to you, it seems to show up pretty well, doesn't it? Well, the internet translates domain names into something called IP addresses because computers really communicate better with numbers. And so an IP address for Internet Protocol address is what's used to route the message. So it's a part, so part of a complete URL consists of the address, but it's just converted to a number by computers on the internet called domain name servers. They're another type of service that's done for you. So domain names typically have 2 parts to them. The registered name, the part that we think of, Bobology, Microsoft, Apple, Google, etc., and then something called a top level domain. That's what comes at the end, .com, .edu, etc. And these top level domains are controlled, whereas registered names can be used by anybody that can get that domain name. But there's a system for all of this that takes place. Top level domains started out with a few. Originally, the internet was started by the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency in the United States. It was a Department of Defense project. And they actually still have a domain name, a top-level domain name that ends in .arpa that only they can use. There are some very restricted ones out there, not too many. The more generic ones like .com, .edu, .gov typically are 3 or more characters. There's a lot of them out there, but these are ones that you're probably familiar with. But you're seeing more of them now because there was a recent effort by an organization that controls domain names to expand the number of domain names to over 1,500 top-level domain names. Now remember, these are only the parts after that last dot. So there's some that are restricted generic where, like .name, it's actually owned by a company called VeriSign, but they do make it available to register your other domain with a .name information in it. And they're sponsored. Some of them can be organizations like an aerospace society registers .aero. Microsoft has registered .microsoft, and other companies have done that as well. And there's country codes, .ca for Canada, our neighbors, .fr for France. And you may have seen some called .io, which is not a specialized thing. It's actually the domain name used by the British Indian Ocean Territory. It's their country code for their internet, but a country code can sell and let people register domain names that come to the left of that dot. So it comes to the left of that dot before the www is something that people can register. But you cannot make up your own top level domain. You only can use what is already in existence out there. And domain registrars, we'll take a look at GoDaddy, one of the registrars, and we'll see what types of things we can do. Okay, so for businesses that are trying to brand themselves, a domain name really gives them branding, okay? And it's just like a trademark like Target or Walmart or any Starbucks or anything you want to use. You want the domain name to be the same as your brand name. And so domain names are really important because people think of them off the top of their head and they type them into their web browsers, and they want people to get to the web page they actually go to. But you'll see sometimes in a URL, the domain name and the .com and then another slash and then some text afterwards. Sometimes that text is the name of a specific page on the website. Sometimes it's a really, really long set of characters, and that's because it's created for a specific time you're on that website, like a shopping cart. So if you're shopping on Amazon or another website and you're putting items in your shopping cart, that session, the time you're actually shopping, might have some page names in the page titles that are very obscure and don't mean anything because they're just there for you for that session that are they're computer generated for them. And domain names can be used in email addresses. Brands want to promote themselves, and every time somebody sends out an email with an @ you can promote Gmail if you're a business, or you can promote yourself if you get a domain name and you pay for an email address using that domain name. You have to pay to use a domain name. They aren't free, but they're out there. And then social media accounts give people names as well. So there's some advice there for brands. The goal is to keep it short. It's really hard to come up with unique domain names, so it's a lot of work these days. You want to make sure you avoid using other trademarks in there. Sometimes it helps to say what you do. I had a student once in one of my marketing classes that ran the business Fullerton Self-Storage, and he had a domain name that was registered fullertonselfstorage.com, and it helped him show up in search results as well. There's a service out there called NameCheck, NAMECHK, that intellectual property attorneys and businesses use to check for names to make sure they can get them not only for the domain, but also for social media accounts, YouTube, and other things too. Now, domain registrars rather, are where domains are rented. So domain registrars are the organizations that are licensed to register domain names. Not everybody can set up a domain registration business. They have to be licensed, and we'll talk about the organization that does that in a few slides. They charge an annual fee for registration. They might charge you a discount up front, but every year you're going to have to pay to make sure that you are the authorized user and owner. You're called owner, but you're really renting it. Because if you stop paying, it goes back into the pool of domain names and anyone else can do it. The registrars prevent duplicate registrations because they all share data with each other. The internet wouldn't work really well if domain names weren't shared around organizations. And so domain registration is something that you can keep private, but the actual domain name is listed publicly in public systems on the internet. Now, the registration of the domain is independent of other services. You can register a domain with one company and have your website hosted with another company, or your email addresses listed with someone else. So it's possible to do that. The domain registration is simply registering the domain in your name so that you are the only person or organization licensed to use it. And so it's possible for you to register any domain that's not already registered by somebody else. And people do that sometimes. They think they're going to set up a business and they want to hold on to the domain name. And so they do that. As long as you pay, it's yours. The two largest companies that do domain registrations are GoDaddy and another one that you might not have heard, one called Network Solutions. Their Network Solutions is used by a lot of people in technical areas, and they provide a lot of services for web hosting services. So we'll take a look at GoDaddy's site because it's a little easier to understand. Now, there's this thing out in the internet called the domain name system. And these are computers that translate URLs to IP addresses, and then they are able to send messages. Because every time you request a web page or send an email, it's got a domain name in it, right? It might have something in front of it like bobcohen@yahoo.com or something else. But if it gets to Yahoo, Yahoo can figure out whose email account it ought to go to. But for it to get from you, say you use Gmail, from getting it from Gmail to Yahoo requires that you send it over the internet. And this thing called a type of computer that's called a domain name system actually does the translation from a domain name to an IP address. Then it says, oh, you're looking for this address. So it's able to forward it faster, and it can get it back to you faster because your computer had an IP address as well. So it's just that this would be really hard to remember for people. It's much easier to remember yahoo.com. And so URLs make it easier to use domain names on the internet because there's these computers that translate URLs and domain names into IP addresses for us. So it's happens automatically. It makes the internet work, and it gets messages to and from everybody all over the world. It's amazing. Now, the organization that's behind all of this is something called the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. Well, that's a mouthful, isn't it? It's called ICON for short. It is an international not-for-profit. Its submission is to preserve the stability of the internet's domain name system. They manage domain names and they manage IP addresses. So every domain name registrar like GoDaddy and Network Solutions, and there's about 300 or 400 of them, they have to be licensed with ICON in order to register domain names. And their offices are right here in Southern California. They're in Playa Vista, California. They actually used to be part of the University of Southern California as part of a research group there that did work for the Department of Defense. So when the internet became non-military and became privatized, they spun off. But they're an international non-for-profit. Their sole purpose is to manage domain names and IP addresses and make sure it all gets registered and works. So they're behind it all. There's a lot of domain names out there now. Okay, so right now you should be seeing a window. I can't make the type any bigger than this, so I'm going to read it off. This is something that is built into Macs. There are equivalent tools in Windows. I just don't use them that much. But a Mac has this thing called a network utility. And a lot of this stuff doesn't mean much of anything, but one of the things you can do is called a trace route. And I can type in an internet address, either the number or the domain name. So if I wanted to see what IP address Microsoft was, this is actually how I looked up Yahoo. So I went to yahoo.com, and then I went over to the blue button here and clicked trace. And it starts a trace route. Now, these are all called hops, okay? So when you go from one location on the internet, one computer to another, to another, to another, to another, to another, to another, to another. There are 18 hops before I actually get to Yahoo, and their IP address that this request is 98.137.11.163. Okay, now that doesn't mean anything to me, but that number tells me where Yahoo was. And each of these numbers is a millisecond in time for how fast that message got from one place to the internet. Because my message, I'm here in Seal Beach, and so I'm connected to Spectrum. So it goes to my router in my home, and then it goes out to Spectrum's router, and then it goes here. You can see these things, SoCalRR.com. And then it goes out to tbonerr.com, and then it got to LAX Yahoo and some other Yahoo, and Yahoo decided to finally send it to this address because it was a web request and I was looking for probably their website. So that's an example of a trace route. Let's do another one, and we'll have some fun with this. So if you wanted to check out what Google is. So, hey, I can go to google.com and the trace route started. So these are all the hops that are taking place from here. These are the same. These are similar because these are my SoCal Roadrunner, which is the old name for Spectrum. But you can see they kept a domain name called roadrunner.com for their computers because that was the name they used for a really long time. They used SoCalRR.com and their domain name is rr.com. And then they finally, at this point, get it from rr.com to Google. And Google doesn't actually display the name here, but at this point, it's probably Google, okay? If we wanted to take another one, and see where that went. We can go to something overseas. We can go to Amazon.es. I ordered something from Amazon Spain recently, so I know where that is. And so let's take a look at that. So hopefully, Amazon ES has multiple addresses, but you can see how your message is getting sent around the world before it finally gets somewhere. And ends up in a destination. Now, there are some companies that block a trace route. They don't want you to know where they're located for security reasons, for example, and other things like that. But, this is something that can take place over time. And obviously, some destinations take a little longer to get to than others before we actually get to them. So it's just an example of something that takes place. Let's take a look at we looked at Microsoft. Let's take a look at Apple.com because they have a lot of cloud services. So if you wanted to get to Apple, you could click on that and do a trace, and it'll trace it all the way out to where Apple is. It looks like it got to world-any.aaplimg.com. It's interesting that sometimes you don't always get to what you think is going to be the domain, but that's what got translated for you. So that's a little utility in computers that people who know how to use the internet would do that. Somebody who's trying to diagnose a network analyst, or somebody that's responsible for a network would probably do that, but other people probably wouldn't. So now you should be seeing GoDaddy's website. So they have a way you can find, they do a lot of services. They provide domains, websites, they do hosting, they do email, office, more. They say .com right here for just $11.99, right? Okay, so that's their starting rate. Sometimes their introductory rate for a year is a little bit different. And so sometimes it takes a little more, but we can type in a domain name. So if I wanted to see if a domain name was available, let's say we want to say Seal Beach, friends, I have to spell it right. and I can just do search, and it could tell me a lot of things. So it'll say sealbeachfriends.com is available. You can register it if you wanted to. $1 a month for the first year. Check what it goes up to. You can have a one-page website. You can get offer. They have a multi-page website, full domain, search tools, a year of professional email starting out. And then they have an e-commerce plan. And then they start to include these other domains. So when we want to look at something like sealbeachfriend.com, but there's also sealbeach-friends.com. Maybe that's something you want. Or you could say sealbeachfriends.online, or Long Beach is nearby, or sealbeachfriends.live. This is one of these top level domains. These things that are after the dot at the end are top level domains. You can't make those up yourself, but you can use them. So there's .xyz, .shop, .net, .com, .biz, .me, .la, .club, .world, .app, .io, .site, .pet, .cc, .network, .pro, store, tech, today, website, TV. These are all top level domains. So you can go to a registrar like GoDaddy and do that. However, for a marketer to educate people that their domain name ends in something other than .com is a lot of work. Okay, but for example, at schools and governments, for example, if you wanted to get to the United States Postal Service, they have USPS.gov, but they're also USPS.com. And they use both top level domains because most people will type in .com. I don't know how many times somebody may have given you an email address and you thought, oh, I'm going to type in .com, but their email might have been .net because it was provided by a company that used an email address that ended in .net. Okay, thank you. All right, bye-bye. We got to go, and we'll talk to you next week, okay? Thanks.